The moment I realized my daughter-in-law had been lying to my son for 2 years, I was standing in my own kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, listening through a door I was never supposed to hear through. I didn't move. I barely breathed. She was on the phone in the hallway, her voice low and clipped, the way it always got when she thought she was the only one in the room. She said, "He's not going to be a problem much longer. I've already talked to Marcus. He agrees the company needs new leadership." Then she laughed. Not a warm laugh, not the kind you share with someone you love, the kind that belongs to a person who has already decided how the story ends. I set the coffee cup down on the counter without making a sound, and I started thinking, that was 14 months ago. I want you to understand where I was in my life before I tell you what happened at the end of it, because the end doesn't make sense unless you understand the beginning. My name is Harold. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years building Mercer Industrial Solutions from a two-man operation in a rented garage in Columbus, Ohio, into a structural engineering and commercial construction firm with 4 regional offices, 218 employees, and contracts with some of the largest development firms on the East Coast. I built that company with my hands and my mind, and about 1,000 sleepless nights, and every dollar my wife Eleanor and I could scrape together in the first decade before anyone believed in us. Eleanor died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. She was gone in 11 weeks from diagnosis. I held her hand at the end, and I told her that everything she had built alongside me was going to be protected. I told her that our son was going to be fine. I believed both of those things when I said them. I'm not sure I believe everything I told her anymore, but I'm getting ahead of myself. My son Marcus is 34. He joined the company 8 years ago after getting his MBA. I was proud of him in ways I never quite found the right words to say out loud. He had his mother's patience and a sharp eye for numbers that I never had. For the first 4 years, we worked well together. The company grew. We opened the Pittsburgh office. We landed a contract that put our name on the front of an industry publication for the first time. Then he met Vanessa. I want to be fair here, because I've spent a lot of time trying to be fair. When Marcus first brought her home for dinner, she was charming, polished, the kind of woman who remembers small details. She asked about a photograph on my bookshelf that nobody had ever asked about, a picture of Eleanor and me on a hiking trail in the Smokies the year before the company took off. She said, "She looks like she's laughing at something only you can see." I thought that was a lovely thing to say. I thought she had a real eye for people. I was right about that, just not in the way I meant it. They married 2 years later. I gave a toast at the rehearsal dinner that made half the table cry. I meant every word. I was genuinely happy for my son. The changes came slowly enough that I almost didn't notice them. Marcus started missing our Monday morning briefings. Then he started sending Vanessa to certain client dinners in his place, which raised eyebrows. I tried not to let anyone see me raising. She began inserting herself into conversations about the company's financial structure, asking questions that were sharp and pointed in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like surveying. She suggested, gently at first, that the company's leadership model was outdated, that a founder-led structure this far into the firm's maturity was limiting growth, that I might be more comfortable in an advisory role. I listened. I nodded. I said I'd think about it. What I actually did was call my lawyer and my accountant and ask them both to come to my house on a Saturday morning when nobody else was around. Let me tell you something about getting older in a business you built. People start to assume a great many things about what you understand and what you don't. They see gray hair and they think they see the past. They assume that because you don't use certain apps or prefer phone calls to video conferences, the software of your mind has stopped updating. Vanessa made that assumption. It was the most expensive mistake she ever made. My lawyer is a man named Douglas. We have known each other for 22 years. He is meticulous and quiet, and he thinks about things from more angles than most people know exist. When I told him what I had heard through the kitchen door, he didn't react with surprise. He reacted the way a very good chess player reacts when they see a move 3 turns ahead. He just nodded slowly and said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning." I told him everything. Douglas listened without interrupting. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You have time, but not unlimited time. The question isn't whether they're planning something. The question is exactly what they're planning and whether they've already started putting it in motion. My accountant, a woman named Patricia who had been with Mercer since year 7, had brought 3 folders with her. She opened them on my kitchen table, one by one. She walked me through what she had noticed over the past 8 months. Small things, individually. Together, they made a picture. There were consulting invoices from a firm I didn't recognize, charged to a discretionary account Marcus had operational authority over. There were 2 meetings on the company calendar that had been scheduled and then deleted, both of them listed originally as involving an outside financial advisory group. There was a signature on a minor vendor contract, not Marcus's usual signatory, but not mine either, that Patricia had flagged because the vendor wasn't in our approved database. I looked at those 3 folders for a long time. Then I said, "What do I need to do?" What followed was 3 months of the quietest, most careful work I have ever done in my life. I came into the office every morning at my normal time. I attended every meeting. I smiled at Vanessa when she came by with Marcus for the company's quarterly lunch, and I complimented the earrings she was wearing, and I meant it, and she had no idea that the night before, Douglas and I had spent 4 hours restructuring the ownership trust that held controlling interest in Mercer Industrial Solutions. I want you to understand what that restructuring involved, because it matters to what happens later. When I founded the company, Eleanor and I held equal shares. When she passed, her shares transferred to a family trust I had set up, of which I was the primary trustee. Marcus was a secondary trustee and a beneficiary. The way the original documents were written, there was a pathway, narrow but real, by which a coordinated effort between Marcus and a third party could petition for a trustee change on grounds of diminished capacity or voluntary withdrawal. It was a mechanism designed for genuine succession planning. In the wrong hands, it was a door. Douglas closed that door. He restructured the trust with a new independent trustee, a fiduciary firm with no connection to anyone in my family, and added language that required unanimous consent from a board of 3 before any trustee change could be initiated. He added a clause that specifically addressed capacity challenges and required independent neurological evaluation by a physician of my choosing, not a family-nominated one. He also added something else, something quiet and elegant, that I'll tell you about when we get there. The months that followed were not easy ones. I don't want to make this sound cleaner than it was. There were nights I sat alone in the house that Eleanor and I had lived in for 27 years, and I thought about my son. I thought about the boy who used to fall asleep on the couch with his head in my lap while I watched football. I thought about the young man who had called me from his college dorm at 2 a.m. when he was scared about failing his finance exam, and I had talked to him until 3:30, and he had passed that exam, and he had called me the next day laughing. I thought about the morning I told him his mother was gone and the way his whole face had changed in a single second. Changed in a way that it never quite came all the way back from. I wanted to believe that the Marcus who was letting this happen was not really my son. That he was being used or manipulated, or that he simply didn't know the full extent of what Vanessa was doing. I wanted to believe that very much. So I decided to find out whether it was true. About 5 months into my quiet preparation, I invited Marcus to lunch. Just the 2 of us, at a diner near the Columbus office, where we used to eat together on Fridays before things changed. He seemed surprised by the invitation. He came, though. He sat down across from me, and for a few minutes he looked like himself. Like the version of my son I had kept stored carefully in the part of my mind where I keep good things. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't mention Vanessa. I asked him how he was sleeping. I asked if he was happy. And then, carefully, I said, "Marcus, if you ever felt like something at the company wasn't going the way it should, you could come to me. That's always been true. You know that." He looked at his coffee cup. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know, Dad." That was all he said. But I watched his face when he said it, and I understood something I hadn't been sure of before. He wasn't leading this. He was following it. He was afraid of something, or someone, and he had made the choice that frightened people sometimes make the choice to look away and let someone else handle things, and tell himself it would probably be okay. That was both better and worse than what I had feared. Better because my son was not the architect of this. Worse because it meant he had been willing to let it happen. I drove home from that lunch and I called Douglas and I told him what I had seen. He said, "That changes a few things." And we talked for 2 hours about how. The meeting happened on a Thursday in November. It was framed as a company leadership review, a formal session with the board of directors, which at Mercer consisted of 4 people: myself, Marcus, our CFO Renata, and an outside director named Paul, who had been on the board for 6 years. Vanessa was not a board member. She had no official role at Mercer Industrial Solutions, but she had attended the last 2 board meetings at Marcus's invitation, sitting beside him, and nobody had objected because she was his wife, and the meetings had been routine. She expected this one to be routine too. Douglas attended as legal counsel. He sat at the far end of the table with 2 associates and a portfolio binder in front of him, and he looked exactly the way Douglas always looks in formal settings. Calm, contained, like a man who has already read the last page of the book. I arrived before everyone else. I had coffee brought in. I was standing at the window looking out at the parking lot when the others came in, and I watched Vanessa walk through the door beside Marcus with that particular expression she wore when she felt like she was walking into something she owned. There is a kind of confidence that comes from believing you have already won. It sits on people in a very recognizable way. She sat down. She opened her portfolio. She uncapped her pen. Marcus sat beside her. He didn't look at me directly when he came in. He looked at the table, at his phone, at the window, anywhere but my face. Renata sat across from them. She gave me a small, steady look when she sat down, the kind of look that means I'm here and I know what this is. Paul settled in beside her and folded his hands. I sat at the head of the table. I said good morning. I asked if everyone had coffee. I made small talk for 2 minutes about a project that had wrapped in Pittsburgh the week before. I was as calm as I have ever been in my professional life, and that calm was not a performance. It was the product of 14 months of preparation, and there is a particular peace that comes from knowing exactly what is in the room with you. Then I said, I want to start today's session with a legal review. Douglas, do you want to walk us through the current structure? Vanessa's pen paused. Douglas opened his portfolio. He said, Of course. He spoke for about 4 minutes in the measured, organized way he always does, laying out the trust structure, the ownership framework, the voting rights attached to each class of shares. Nothing surprising yet. The kind of thing anyone on a board should know and periodically review. Then he said, I also want to document for the record that over the past 8 weeks, this office received 2 formal inquiries, one from an outside legal firm and one from a financial advisory group, requesting documentation related to a potential trustee substitution petition for the Mercer Family Trust. The room was quiet. I watched Vanessa's face. She didn't move. She was good. I'll give her that. But there is a particular kind of stillness that is not composure. It's the stillness of a person who has just felt the floor shift under them and is deciding whether to pretend they didn't feel it. Marcus looked up from the table for the first time since he had sat down. He looked at Douglas. Then he looked at me. Douglas continued. He said the inquiries had come from entities that, upon examination, were linked through a holding company to a financial consulting arrangement that had been invoiced to Mercer's discretionary operational account over the preceding 10 months. He said the total amount was not trivial. He said that the trustee substitution inquiries had cited a clause in the original trust documents that was no longer present, having been modified through a legitimate amendment process 8 months prior. He set his pen down and folded his hands on the table and said, The door those inquiries were attempting to open does not exist anymore. Vanessa said, I don't know what any of this has to do with today's agenda. Her voice was I was impressed, honestly. I said, It has to do with today's agenda because today's agenda includes a discussion about the company's future leadership structure, which I understand you have prepared some materials on. I looked at the portfolio in front of her. Please, go ahead. She looked at me. It was a long look. She was recalculating. Then she opened the portfolio. Because she was committed, because she had spent months on this, and she still believed there was a path. People who have invested that much in a plan do not abandon it easily. They look for the angle they haven't tried yet. She presented a proposal. It was thorough, I'll give her that. It called for a formal transition of executive leadership to Marcus as sole CEO, a restructuring of my role to a non-voting advisory capacity, and a new compensation framework tied to a performance model that would, over the course of 3 years, significantly reduce my equity participation in the company's annual distributions. It was, in financial terms, a slow and legal erosion. She spoke for 11 minutes. Her voice never wavered. She cited industry benchmarks and comparable companies and a consulting report from the firm whose invoices I had been looking at for months. She talked about growth potential and organizational agility and the value of a unified leadership vision. She did not say the word retirement. She did not say the word old. She didn't need to. The architecture of the proposal said both things very clearly. When she finished, she looked around the table. Renata was writing something on a notepad. Paul was looking at his hands. Marcus was looking at the table. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "That's a very detailed proposal. Thank you." I paused. "I do have a question. Which of the two of you is presenting this as a board member?" she said. Marcus and I discussed it together. He asked me to present it because I have more experience with this kind of restructuring analysis. I said, "Marcus, is that right?" My son looked up. He looked at Vanessa. He looked at me. And something happened in his face in that moment that I had been waiting 14 months to see. A small shift, a crack in the looking away. He said, "Dad, I said gently, "It's all right, Marcus. You don't need to say anything right now." I looked at Douglas. Douglas said, "There is one more item for the record." He reached into the portfolio and removed a single document, a printed sheet that he slid across the table toward Vanessa. "This is a forensic accounting summary prepared by an independent firm, commissioned 6 months ago. It documents the redirection of approximately $240,000 from Mercer operational accounts to the consulting firm referenced in your proposal, which is registered to a holding company with a single beneficial owner." He paused. "That owner is not Marcus." The room was silent. I watched Vanessa look at the document. I watched her face do something complicated and controlled, and then go very still. Douglas said, "The beneficial owner of that holding company is registered to an address in Scottsdale, Arizona." He paused. "Which is the same address used by the LLC that Vanessa incorporated in 2021, prior to her marriage to Marcus." Marcus turned his head and looked at his wife. Renata put her pen down. Paul looked at the ceiling briefly, and then back at the table. Vanessa said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "This is not what it looks like." I said, "I know what it looks like to you. I imagine it looks like something that can be explained. But you should know that Douglas has already filed the relevant documentation with the appropriate regulatory bodies, and the independent trustee for the Mercer Family Trust has been briefed in full. None of that is reversible by anything that happens in this room today." She looked at me. For the first time, the calibration was gone. What was left was something rawer than I expected. Not quite fear. Something more like the expression of a person who had built a very elaborate structure in their mind and was watching it come apart piece by piece and couldn't find the loose thread to pull to stop it. She looked at Marcus. He was looking at the table. I said, "Marcus?" He looked up. I said, "I want you to know that I am not angry with you. I know the difference between someone who builds a plan and someone who gets pulled along by one. I've been watching the difference for 14 months. I paused. I also want you to know that what happens next with the company is genuinely a conversation I am willing to have. A real one. Not in a boardroom. At the diner, on a Friday, the way we used to." His jaw worked. He nodded once. Very small. I looked back at Vanessa. I said, "The board is going to take a brief recess. I'd suggest using that time wisely." She stood up from the table. She picked up her portfolio. She was controlled, still, even now. She walked out of the boardroom without saying anything else, and I watched her go, and I thought about the woman who had said Eleanor looked like she was laughing at something only I could see, and I felt something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite relief, but lived somewhere between the two. The recess lasted 12 minutes. When the board reconvened, Vanessa was not in the building. What happened after that happened the way things do when a structure collapses cleanly, faster than expected, with less noise than you anticipate. Douglas handled the coordination with the regulatory bodies. Patricia and the independent accounting firm provided supplementary documentation. The consulting firm that had received the redirected funds was contacted by attorneys and declined to engage further. The forensic paper trail was thorough, and it was thorough because I had started building it 14 months earlier, the morning after I heard a laugh in my own hallway that didn't belong there. Marcus came to the diner 3 weeks later. He sat across from me, and he looked about 10 years older than the last time I had seen him there. And he ordered coffee, and he didn't say anything for a while. And then he said, "Dad, I need you to tell me if there's a version of this where I'm not the worst person you know." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "You're not even close to the worst person I know. And I think you've known for a while that something was wrong. And I think the hardest thing you're going to have to live with is that you didn't come to me sooner." He nodded. He stared at his coffee. I said, "I also think you're 34 years old and you made a mistake that a lot of people make, which is trusting someone who turned out not to deserve it. That is a painful thing. It is not an unforgivable thing." He said, "She's filing for divorce." I said, "I know." He said, "Is the company?" I said, "The company is fine. The company was always going to be fine. I built it for 31 years, and I was not going to let it go without a fight." I paused, but I also didn't build it to fight my son. I built it because your mother and I had a dream, and part of that dream was that it would outlast us, and that you would be part of it. He looked up at that. I said, "So the question is whether you still want to be." He said, "Do you still want me to be?" I said, "Marcus, you are the reason I kept the chair at the head of the table this long. I was always going to hand it to you eventually. I just needed to know that when I did, it would be handed to you, not taken by someone standing behind you." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know you are." We sat in that diner for 2 hours that morning. We talked about the Pittsburgh office and the new contract in Richmond and a structural project in the works that I thought he was going to be very excited about. We talked about Eleanor, which we almost never do, but we did that morning. He told me he still thought about her every day. I told him I did too. When we left, he walked to his car, and I walked to mine. He stopped before he got in, and he turned around and he said, "Dad?" "The thing Douglas put in the trust. The final clause." He paused. "Patricia told me what it says." I said, "She wasn't supposed to tell you that." He said, "She's terrible at keeping secrets." He paused. "It says that in the event of a successful hostile takeover attempt against the founder, the controlling shares revert entirely to the founder's discretionary control. No board approval required." He looked at me. "You built a trap." I said, "I built a door that locked from the inside." He almost smiled. It was the first almost smile I had seen from him in 2 years, and it looked a great deal like his mother's. I drove home to the house on Clearview, the one Eleanor and I had bought the year Marcus was born. I walked in through the side door, the one that sticks a little in November when the wood swells with the cold. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, the same kitchen where 14 months ago I had set down a cold cup of coffee and started thinking. I made fresh coffee. I sat down at the table. I looked at the photograph on the refrigerator door, the one from the Smokies, the one Vanessa had noticed the first night Marcus brought her to dinner. Eleanor is laughing in it. She is laughing at something I had just said, something I genuinely cannot remember anymore, something small and stupid and private between the two of us. I looked at that photograph for a while. I thought about what I had told Eleanor at the end, that everything she had built would be protected, that our son was going to be fine. I thought about how much of the 14 months that had just passed had been motivated by those two promises. I think she would have been proud of the legal documents. She always said I was a better strategist than I gave myself credit for. She used to say that the thing about builders is they don't just build forward, they build load-bearing. They put the supports in place before the weight arrives. I think she would have been less interested in the strategy and more interested in the diner. She would have asked me exactly what Marcus said, and exactly what I said, and whether he ordered the eggs or just coffee. She was always more interested in the human parts than the structural parts. I suppose that's why she was better with people than I was, and why she kept me honest when I was more interested in winning than in what winning was for. I sipped my coffee, and it was warm this time. I thought about the conference room, about Vanessa walking out without saying anything, and I thought about how I had almost felt something like regret for her. Not sympathy, exactly. More like the particular recognition of a person who has spent years building a plan and felt it come apart in their hands, and how that is a specific and terrible feeling regardless of what the plan was. I wouldn't wish it on someone I cared about. I didn't feel the need to celebrate it with someone I didn't. What I felt, mostly, was tired. The tired that comes after a long project that required continuous attention, when you have finally set it down and your hands aren't quite sure what to do with themselves. And underneath the tired, something else, something warmer, the thing that had been the actual point all along, underneath the legal documents and the restructured trust and the carefully closed doors. A Friday morning at a diner with my son, 2 cups of coffee, and a conversation that moved forward instead of away. That is what 31 years of building looks like when it holds, not the contracts or the offices or the columns in the industry publication. The son who turns around in a parking lot and says something that sounds exactly like his mother used to sound, with that half smile that I had been missing for 2 years. I got up and I washed my coffee cup. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard. At the oak tree Eleanor had insisted on planting the year we moved in, which had seemed too ambitious at the time, and now had a trunk I couldn't wrap both arms around. I thought, she was always right about what was going to last. I thought, I have some phone calls to make about the Richmond project. I have a Monday morning briefing to prepare. I have a chair at the head of a table that I plan to keep warm a little longer, not because I'm afraid to leave it, but because the person I'm leaving it to needs a little more time, and I have a little more time to give, and there is something to be said for doing things at the right pace rather than someone else's. I dried my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. Eleanor's dish towel, a faded yellow one she had bought at a market in Savannah on a trip we took the year before she got sick. I've washed it so many times the color is almost entirely gone. I can't bring myself to replace it. I picked up my phone and called Douglas. He answered on the second ring. He said, "How are you doing?" I said, "Better than I've been in about 14 months. He said, "Good." I thought so. A pause. "Marcus called me this morning." I said, "What did he say?" Douglas said, "He asked me to walk him through the trust documents, the whole thing, from the beginning. He said he wanted to understand how it actually worked." A pause. "He asked a lot of good questions." I said, "He always did." Douglas said, "Harold." I said, "Yes." He said, "You should know that the consulting firm in Arizona has engaged counsel. It's going to get complicated before it gets simple." I said, "Is it going to be a problem?" He said, "No, but it's going to be a process. Are you ready for that?" I thought for a moment about 14 months ago, about the cold coffee and the locked door and the decision to start thinking, about Patricia and her 3 folders and Douglas and his meticulous angles, about the way a good structure holds weight if you build it right. I said, "Douglas, I've been building things that hold for 31 years. A complicated process is just another project." He laughed. He said, "I'll send you the documents tonight." I said, "Send them in the morning. Tonight I'm going to sit outside with a glass of something and not think about legal documents." He said, "That sounds right." I hung up and went to find my coat. The sky outside was the particular flat gray of a Columbus November afternoon, the kind that sits low and close and smells like something cold that hasn't arrived yet. I sat on the back porch in the wooden chair that has been on that porch for 17 years, and I looked at the oak tree, and I thought about nothing structured or strategic or load-bearing. I just thought about the next Friday, about the diner, about whether Marcus would order the eggs this time, or just coffee. I was looking forward to finding stout.